Secret Level has just released the final batch of episodes which make up the first season of the anthology based on a plethora of video game franchises. With 15 episodes making up the anthology, which ranged from different runtimes, art styles, and depth of story, there was always going to be some which were better than the others. And I thought I'd highlight exactly that and rank the episodes of the series from worst to best. So with that, let's dive into the video and I'll share what I feel was the worst episode and which one came out on top. So let's get into it. Here is Secret Level, every episode ranked. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. Number 15, Episode 10, Mega Man, Start. Coming in last place on this list is the 10th episode of the anthology. This was the shortest episode out of the bunch, coming in at what felt like about 5 minutes. The story didn't really have much weight to it, there was no real time to care for or understand the characters, and even though the animation style and art style stood out because it was so different to the realism that a lot of the episodes were going for, it just fell short and was probably the most forgettable episode out of the bunch. The explosion was cool, but that was pretty much it. Definitely my least favourite. Number 14, Episode 12, Spelunky, Tally. The episode that I thought was probably the second worst was episode 12 of the show. This one had a deeper meaning than Mega Man, but at its core it was about a 2D game that needed a stronger story embedded within it, with it focusing on how we should pretty much appreciate life and how for each of the regenerations that they had, they should be framed as adventures rather than deaths. It did kind of translate across to our everyday lives, in the sense that every day should be looked at as a reset if the day before didn't go as planned, which is something that I liked, but overall the weight of the story just wasn't there. The art style was quite cool though. Number 13, Episode 7, Crossfire, Good Conflict. I thought there were elements of Crossfire that were pretty good. The whole "we're not the bad guys" motif being repeated by all parties, no matter what side they were on, was something which felt like it shone a light on the fact that in war, nobody believes that they're the bad guy, when in reality, to the opposition, they are the bad ones. The art style was something that didn't look that great if I'm being honest. It looked a bit like a cutaway scene from the game rather than a stylistic piece of television. The story had thought-provoking elements, but the fact that we were just thrown into that world at the moment of the climax and we didn't get any kind of resolution, it just made it feel a bit off when the credits rolled. Number 12, Dungeons & Dragons, The Queen's Cradle. Okay, I feel I could get a bit of stick on this one for putting it so low, but for some reason it just didn't quite do it for me. I thought the story was really cool, and the art style was super realistic and glossy to look at, but when it came to the connection to the characters, I just didn't really feel it. There were also characters that I found annoying, such as Tally with all of the cheesy lines that she kept on saying. Tiamat being introduced was a great moment in the episode, and the scenes where Solon was speaking with Oriel were also epic from a visual perspective too. But for me, I just didn't connect with this one at all. Number 11, Episode 15, Playtime, Fulfillment. For me, this was just an episode that was a fun ride and didn't take itself too seriously, and in an anthology filled with heavy stories, I feel like you need that. The story wasn't really that interesting, but it was just an episode that was full of Easter eggs and characters across multiple different games in the PlayStation world. Seeing the ragdoll from Little Big Planet appear was humorous, and I thought the line, "the world used to look like this every day," hit hard. Because it felt like it was a nod to the fact that when we were younger, our world was just full of imagination, characters, and the worlds that we immersed ourselves into whilst playing video games. The art style also reflected that point of view too, with it being heavily animated and cartoon looking. The story almost reminded me of the second Wreck-It Ralph movie where he encountered loads of characters from different games when he went into the internet. Number 10, Episode 13, Concord, Tale of the Implaceable. I thought this was a pretty powerful episode. The style that it had in terms of it being a story that was getting told to us by a narrator, and also the freezing of the visuals, reminded me of a style that Guy Ritchie would go for. That probably paired with the fact that the narrator had the English gangster style voice too. The story being focused on space pirates was a cool concept, and the ending connecting back to the start with us seeing the crew going through the Tempest after devaluing the most valuable thing in the universe was a nice way for it to round off. I thought the twist with Julius being killed and the captain being saved by a crew member that it felt like was against her was something that I didn't see coming, and it was a strong moment for sure. The score in this episode was also really atmospheric and suited the setting of it being in space. This was a solid episode for sure and deserved to make it into the top 10. Number 9, Episode 5, Warhammer 40,000 Feet. Okay, I know this is probably going to be higher up on other people's rankings, but this one just didn't connect with me. There were some incredible moments in it for sure. I loved the way that Matoris still viewed Titus as the damaged little boy that he saved several years ago. I thought the battle scenes in this episode were epic to watch, and the way that they just walked through any opposition was also really cool to see. I'd also say that the sorceress was menacing and nightmare-inducing when it came to the design, but the message of this episode just didn't really land with me. From a visual perspective and action perspective, this one is definitely up there, but the story just didn't really have that much going on. Number 8, Episode 14, Honor of Kings, The Way of All Things. This episode was one that was genuinely incredible to watch. Yujing was motivated by the devastation that was around him in the city and the loss of his parents, and he wanted to make the place a better one for himself and those that inhabited it. The story was one that was simple, yet also complex to follow, which meant that it had a lot of depth to it. He was willing to sacrifice himself for the betterment of the city, and we believe that he did win against the AI, which was Tiangong, which was also able to predict his every move. However, with the closing moments revealing that Tiangong was still around, it begged the question on if he did actually win, or if the Tiangong did predict that that very thing would happen. Visually, this one was stunning. The seamless motion of the characters transforming and also the environment changing was impressive to see. The water genuinely looked real in this world, and I'd say that you could feel the emotions that the character was suffering with. This was an all-round great episode for sure. I've never played the game, but it was an episode that definitely made me want to. Number 7, Episode 4, Unreal Tournament, Zan. This was an episode that sat with me long after it finished, and it grew on me with time. There was barely any dialogue in this episode, and it was one that was about a robot becoming sentient and wanting out of the life that it had, where it was viewed as a lesser being, and was abused and seen as disposable. It was a relatively predictable story that's been told since the birth of sci-fi, but that definitely didn't mean that it wasn't enjoyable. The fight scenes in this episode were really exciting to watch. The use of the voiceover during the fights made it feel like a video game was being played, and the ending where Zan actually won was one that was bittersweet. Bittersweet in the sense that you found yourself rooting for the very thing that could bring the end for humanity. It was a thought-provoking one for sure, and one that's easy to rewatch because of the short runtime. Number 6, Episode 6, Pac Man, Circle. This is an episode that I know wasn't that well liked, but I did actually really enjoy it. It took the game Pac Man and made it feel like there were some layers to the story. Having this orb that was constantly seeking to escape and manipulating the subject of the episode, which I feel was representative of us, was a cool way to frame this episode and the story of Pac Man. This was a pretty short episode, but it packed a punch for sure. There were some great moments visually, such as when the orb went inside of the creature, and also when they were combined we saw the infamous Pac Man shape. The circular nature of the story and the fact that it was something that the orb had to do every time the player would respawn back in also got across the nature of the game. This was a creative episode that I feel would have definitely been fun to have been in the writer's room for. Number 5, Episode 8, Armored Core Asset Management. Without a doubt, this was definitely the best episode to look at. It genuinely looked real, and even the camera movements that they mimicked in this episode made it feel like an actual environment and almost like a movie. This moment here with the cigarette in the snow was just gorgeous to look at. Even the crushing of the head at the end was absolutely brutal, and they didn't shy away from showing it. Keanu Reeves delivered a strong performance of a character that was the last of his kind and was also a damaged individual. This was a really intimate episode with the way that we got to know the character and even the positioning of the camera by just having it showing his face for a lot of the time. The piece of AI that he had embedded within his brain was something that was ever present and was almost like the emotional support for him. The fact that it was said that humans weren't built for isolation, and the moment that it stopped speaking, he panicked. It showed the fear that he actually had. Keanu Reeves' character wanted to wipe out the opposition and felt like nobody was ever going to be like him. So it was a bleak ending for sure. Considering the runtime of this episode was only about 11 minutes, it packed a story, looked incredible, had character relatability, and it was filled with action. Definitely deserves to be in the top 5. Number 4, Episode 9, The Outer World, The Company We Keep. I absolutely loved this episode. Amos was definitely the most likable character in the entirety of the anthology. This was essentially an episode about a nice guy being manipulated all for the feelings that he had for a girl, whilst it also shone a light on the exploitation of capitalism and the way that businesses pretty much don't care about their consumers as long as they thrive and rise to the top. I really found myself feeling for the character of Amos, and the only time that we saw him actually lie, something he was unable to do, was because he was in love with Dr. Felicity, somebody that was about to unleash hell onto the world. We saw what the testing of their products did to him, and that was going to be happening to regular folk with the testing being cancelled. The love and desire that he had to be with somebody cost him everything that pretty much made him human, other than his mind. But even then, I'd say that the ending showed that it also cost him that too. The world in this episode felt so fleshed out. The characters felt like they had a lot of depth, and despite the light-hearted design of this episode with the way that it looked, it was actually quite a heavy episode that I'd pretty much describe as very human. This was definitely one of my favourites for sure. Number 3, Episode 11, Exodus Odyssey. This was definitely an episode that felt like it was inspired by Nolan's movie Interstellar, especially with the way that time moved differently depending on which planet you were on. Whilst this episode was all about travelling through space and time moving differently, it was actually more so focused on a father's love for his child and that he'd do anything, even if it cost him his own life in order to get her back, and that's exactly what we saw unfolding. By the end of the episode, we saw that Mari was old and died due to her age and injuries, and Rick returned to his home planet several years later and gave an artifact to Thaddeus' granddaughter in order to give the planet some kind of restoration. His hunt for Mari was something that made him want to become a traveller, something that he never could have imagined at the start of the episode. This episode was simply full of adventure, and it took us, as well as the main characters, on a real ride. There were also emotional moments within it because, as I said at the start, it was about a father's love for his daughter and how he'd lose his own time in order to get her back. This was a really strong one for sure. Number 2, Episode 3, New World, The Once and Future King. Coming in second place is the episode which starred Arnie himself. This was an episode that felt like an old school fable that you'd be told in school, and how the very thing that you desire might not end up being worth it if you've got nobody to share your success with. King Elstrom was such an interesting character to follow, and it felt like he went on a real journey of self-discovery, something that we could all relate to in some kind of way. Small details such as Scavola always picking him up, but then right at the end, when Elstrom wanted to be friends again after destroying the very crown that he was hungry for in order to build Scavola an arm, he picked him up for the first time in the entire runtime, showing that he was a transformed person. There was definitely something off with the lip syncing in this episode, but I'm prepared to look past it because the story and meaning was so strong. I also thought the opening scene on the ship with the smooth transitions of them ending up on the island was a great way of providing some kind of backstory in a really short way. This was definitely one of my favourite episodes, and the meaning that it held was the second strongest for sure. Number 1, Episode 2, Sifu, It Takes a Life. The best episode in the entirety of Secret Level was definitely the one that was focused on Sifu. The message of this episode and the fact that it focused on the cost of revenge and making you question if it was worth the price that it would come at was such a powerful message to have. Considering this was one of the shortest episodes, it packed one of the largest punches for sure. There was barely any dialogue, but every piece that it had held importance. Such as the conversation around if 60 years of perfecting a recipe was something that was worth it, and it relating to every time that MC coming back slightly older after dying felt poetic. As well, the opening scene and the ending scene mirroring each other and the water rippling and revealing that he was still young inside was an amazing moment to see. That singular frame summed up the whole plot and point of the episode and the game. This was an episode that made me want to play the game because the concept felt so original and so cool. This is my ranking of the episodes, and whilst Secret Level was an enjoyable show to watch, I don't think it's on the same level as Love, Death and Robots. There was only the occasional amazing episode, and I'd say too many of the games were in the same category, which made some of them lose a lot of impact. It felt so heavily space related that when I'd see an episode open and it'd be set in space, I'd almost think, here we go again. I do hope they make a season 2, but I just hope they have a bit more variety in it. So, there you have it, Secret Level, every episode ranked. What was your favourite episode? Do you agree with my ranking? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. As always, thanks for tuning into the video and I'll see you in the next one.